Hello. Today we're going to take a quick look at cloud governance overall across three major CSPs, AWS, Azure, and GCP. And we're going to examine how the structure of that cloud governance differs across the three CSPs. All right, to begin in AWS, the two services we're going to look at today will be AWS Organizations and Control Tower. Now, other services are also hugely important. For example, Control Tower very much integrates with CloudFormation and Security Hub and Config and other services. And on top of that, you can actually use CloudFormation to deploy almost all the controls, except for those that Control Tower absolutely needs to control in order to be deployed at all. But we're just going to look at Control Tower and AWS Organizations today. Opening up Control Tower, you wouldn't see any of this if you hadn't already deployed your landing zone, but here you can see the organizational units, how many we have deployed, and the accounts, and preventive, detective, and proactive controls. Now, proactive controls refer to CloudFormation hooks. As previously noted, you can use CloudFormation to deploy most of your controls, but these proactive controls actually rely on CloudFormation hooks in order to control what your later infrastructure as code deployments are able to do. And then detective controls are typically going to be Security Hub and Config. And then preventive controls will be in AWS Organizations, where you can block certain activities from happening at all. We're not going to have time to go through all of these, but here in Organizations is where you're going to see both your accounts as well as your OUs that you've set up. And in the landing zone settings is where you could modify how you've deployed your control tower. So here, as you can see, to quickly run through this, we've only selected one region right now for our sandbox for this particular demo, and that is US East 1. You do have to have at least one obviously selected. Going through here, you could either elect to deny other regions or not. In other words, actually prohibit access to AWS services and operations in other regions. We have opted to enable that so that it is denied in other regions where we don't want services and operations occurring. Then you could also elect to either have Control Tower set up your identity center and control your AWS account access through that, or you could elect to use self-managed IAM Identity Center and possibly integrate with another IDP like we did with Azure Active Directory, for example. And then here we have our CloudTrail configuration for all of the accounts. And we also have our log configurations for how long we want to retain the logging. And then here we have selected that we want to use KMS encryption. We do not want to disable encryption settings. And then we also did want to enable AWS backup. You would go to the next page then, and you would review all the settings that you wanted to modify and then update your landing zone here. All right, now to quickly go over to AWS Organizations. Here, as you can see, we have our policies that control all of the accounts except this management account in which they live. We have our AWS Services opt-out policies where we can disallow data sharing, and backup policies and chat application policies, etc. All of these that you see here. But Control Tower primarily focuses on service control policies and then somewhat on resource control policies and declarative policies as well. To take a super quick look at that in service control policies, here is where these controls are applied to the target OU, which you would find here, non-core in this case, and then you would find the content of what is actually being restricted or enforced across whatever accounts are in that OU in the content. Now, without taking a lot of time to go over this, this is where the broadest boundary of what you're allowing in your overall organization with all of its member accounts is done. It's very important to note, however, that if you have accounts outside of these OUs, they will not be impacted and they will not be properly controlled. So to quickly demonstrate that, I want to go back to Control Tower where we took two of them out to show you that. All right, here in Control Tower, if you look at organizations, you can see that we have our SecAudit Core OU here, where we have the security account, logs account, backup, and shared services. And then we have the perimeter core account, which is where we previously had the network and the SSO accounts. However, we unenrolled those, which means, importantly, that if you unenroll accounts and they are not in an OU that's protected by Control Tower, then they are not going to be protected. All right, now I'm going to move over to Azure because I want to compare Azure Policy with AWS Organizations and more specifically with service control policies within that. So first of all, let's go over to AWS Organizations again. And then here, as we did before, we're going to go to Policies, and within Policies, we're going to go to Service Control Policies. All right, now here in Azure, if you wanted to create a policy collection, that is called an initiative definition here, and you would find that under Policy Authoring Definitions. Here in Definitions, you could either create a policy, a single policy, or a group of policies, which is called an initiative definition. Now, importantly, a policy in Azure does not equate to a policy in AWS, right? This is a service control policy, but this really is a collection of statements. So to open one up, let's take a really quick look at this. Here we have in AWS a condition. You can see this is a statement, right? Not every statement has a condition, but a lot of the ones in the SCPs do, so let's just go with that. Here we have a condition that starts this statement. Next we have another condition that starts another statement, and so forth. We have lots of these throughout here, right? Condition. This one says that no role that is not this role is going to be able to modify the encryption configuration, for example. So it's denied to this action is denied to every role except for this one. This is a statement within an AWS policy, but that statement would equate to a single policy in Azure, because in Azure, each policy just deals with one thing. So for example, here we have restrict location of information processing, storage, and services. That's one policy. And vulnerability assessment should be enabled on your Synapse workspaces. That's another policy, etc. In AWS, you might put lots of those in a single policy via the statements, right? Here's a condition that deals with the encryption configuration, whereas the first one that we were looking at up here dealt with logs, right? There is a lot of similarity nonetheless between how you could apply these policies and how you could apply the Azure initiatives to the various levels. So let's just go with an initiative definition, keeping in mind this is a group of policies. This would be a single statement in AWS or called a policy in Azure. But say we want to create an initiative definition and it's going to be a collection of policies. First, we're going to select the scope. Do we want to apply this at the tenant root group, or are we going to apply it to, say, a management group within that or to a subscription within that? Let's just say we're going to go with the tenant root group. So we selected that, we select it, and now that's what we're applying it at. And then let's just pick a name. We'll say new test, and we're going to skip the rest of this and just go straight to policies, just to show this demonstration really quickly. And then we're going to say that we're going to add policy definitions. So let's just say that we want to look at the encryption ones. Then we'll just select encryption, and when we hit that, we're going to see all of the policies that have the word encryption in them. Here's where maybe we say that we want to have our encryption policy initiative, and we're going to look through that and be structured in the way that we develop these initiatives, so that, say, maybe one of our initiatives deals with encryption at rest, another one deals with encryption in transit, another one deals with, say, private endpoints, and so on. Another one deals with logging, etc., right? And then you have those structured according to the standards that you as a company have already decided are going to be your standards. And then your policy initiatives are aligned to that. So that's how you would do that. But you would have to look through all of these, think through them, maybe even create a custom policy yourself, and then apply those to your initiative, create your initiative, apply it to the scope that it needs to be at, etc. Now in AWS, similarly, you would apply your service control policies, which again are similar to an initiative definition, and you would apply those also at the target, whether that's going to be either the root or the organizational unit, which would be a management group in Azure, or to individual accounts, or that would equate to a subscription in Azure, right? In AWS, that would be an account. So you can do that too with what in AWS would be called a policy, but in Azure would be called an initiative, right? Now, obviously in Azure, you can attach individual policies also at this scope, but it is not very efficient to do that. I don't recommend it. I recommend that you take your structure, like we talked about in another video, and you establish, first of all, your standards. Know in your head, and preferably in documentation, what your standards are, and then you come at this, at your cloud structure, with those standards in mind. You build out your initiatives, or in AWS, you build out your SCPs and your other policies, not just SCPs, but also your resource control policies and your declarative policies and your AI services opt-out policies. All of that should be aligned to your standards. And you do the same thing here in Azure as well, keeping in mind that your initiative definitions can be searched on by keyword. You could look for, let's do network security. All right, let's see what that pulls up. Yep, enable logging by category group for Microsoft Network, You can look through all of these, right? You could also look up, say, private endpoint, and see what that says. Private endpoint connections on batch accounts should be enabled. You can enforce that type of thing too, right? Private DNS zone. Private often deals with network, not always, but very often. So these are all things you're going to want to consider. In AWS, the policies are collections of statements. In Azure, your policy initiatives are collections of policies, and both equate to roughly the same thing. Now we're going to take a look at GCP. Now in GCP, projects are the equivalent of subscriptions in Azure and accounts in AWS. Here we see a project, which is denoted by these three dots here, and if we click on that, we will be taken to the page with either the recent projects and organization that was looked at, or all, depending on which tab you're on. But here you can see 3 projects, and you can also see the organization denoted by this icon right here. Clicking on that, we can now set the organization policies for the entire organization. So first of all, let's go over to organizations. We're going to find those in I am an admin, and then right here across from there, organization policies. When we get to organization policies, it's really important to note that you're going to find all of these same policies, and there are 170 of them currently, as you can see here. All of these same policies will be both at the organization level and at each project level. Furthermore, if we had folders in here, which we don't right now in this sandbox, but if we had folders in here, those folders would be the equivalent of AWS OUs or Azure Management Groups, and policies could likewise be applied at folder level. For now, we're going to look at the organization level and take a look at how we would think through our standards and apply those to organization policies in GCP. All right, so Google by default gives you a security baseline right here, as you can see, and it only contains 50 plus policies of the entire 170 policies that Google has right now. Another thing that's really good to know is that you're able to set dry run policies, meaning that you can set a policy that is in audit mode and it will let you know what would be broken potentially so that you can check that before actually deploying it into production. A third really important thing to know is that in Google, similar to Azure and similar to AWS, you can create custom policies, but you're more restricted in Google. GCP does allow you to create custom organization policies, but it only allows you to do that for certain constraints. These are called constraints. If you open up any one of these policies, you are going to see the constraint ID right here, which is compute.manage. Right? And Google only allows you to write custom policies for certain constraints that it lists in its documentation. Now, Azure does also have some constraints. For example, here in Azure, when we go back to the initiative definition and we look at the policies, let's pick one that will be cut and dried. So storage account keys should not be expired. All right, we're going to add that one, and then we're going to skip straight to policy parameters. And in policy parameters, we're going to uncheck the box that only would show parameters that need input or review. The reason this happens is because there's a default value of audit, and unless you change that, it's going to remain like this. So we're going to change it from the default value to set value, and we're going to say that we're going to modify this to be deny instead. Now, Azure has different values that could be applied depending on the policy type. This one supports audit, deny, or it's disabled altogether. So we would probably pick deny here because we obviously do not want to be allowing storage keys that are expired. But the important thing to note is that we are restricted to only audit or deny. Now, in some other policy types, you would have the option of having, say, modify or deploy if not exists, etc. And those are all going to depend on the specific policy type. So there are some limitations too in Azure. I would say in AWS, you can pretty much write whatever policy you want, but you're going to have to make sure that it actually functions in accordance with the Amazon structure. All right, so going back to GCP again, here in GCP, you're going to want to categorize your standards here again. You can see what they offer as the defaults for storage, right? Cloud storage, restrict authentication types, that would be a good thing to have. And soft delete policy, retention duration in seconds. Compute storage resources, use restrictions, and public access prevention. These are definitely things you would want to have in place for storage, right? So you're going to want to check by your categories first by storage, then by possibly network. So for example, we can look at VPC, and we can see that we have some settings that we can apply for the external IPv6, and requiring a VPC connector for cloud functions, and etc. And then we can look at network, and we could look at other things too to get some additional options here, right? But one of the things I want to note about GCP is there's a lot more limitations when it comes to policies. Azure would give you thousands of policies, literally. If you go and you say you want to export all of the built-in policies in Azure, you're going to have thousands of options, thousands of policy options. In GCP, you have 170. I would strongly suggest that you simply read through them and see where you have gaps. So for example, restrict external IPs, you're going to be able to see from that, open it up and take a look at what it means, right? You're going to see what options you have here. This is in public preview. This constraint defines whether Compute Engine VM instances are allowed to use an external IP address. By default, they're all allowed to use an external IP address. If enforced, this constraint will deny the creation or update of VM instances with external IP addresses. So this is something that you would want to set if you don't want people to have compute engines that have public access, right? And that is definitely a best practice to prevent that. Given that you only have, in Google, given that you only have 170 policies, I strongly recommend that you simply take these, align them to your standards that you've built out for your company, and then check where you have gaps. Now, this is where it's really useful to compare across CSPs. You can compare whatever you have here after you've aligned these to your standards with what you've been able to do in AWS and what you've been able to do in Azure, and then you can see what you should be able to do in GCP or the same in Azure or AWS. Now, one other really important thing to note in GCP is that you can set the organization policies at the either folder, which doesn't exist right here, or project level 2, right? You're going to have the same options, the same organization policies that you can set here. And when you do this, it actually overrides the parent. So if we take this one here and we go to manage the policy, we can see that we have several options here. We're either going to inherit the parent's policy, which is the default, or we're going to have a Google managed default, or we're going to override the parent's policy. When you do that, when you write a rule here, that's not necessarily going to show up in the parent's policy. That's an important thing to note. In Azure, if you make a change to a parent policy, it's going to be through an exemption. In AWS, it would be through a condition. But either way, it's going to appear in the parent policy. It's going to be seen in correlation with that parent's policy. In GCP, on the other hand, you can actually write a totally different policy at the child's level, and it can override the parent's policy. And at the parent's policy, you're not going to have visibility into that. That's something really important to understand as well about organization policies in GCP. All right, there's so much more that could be said. There are VPC service controls. There are also SCC, Security Command Center, which offers you a lot of threat intelligence, particularly at the paid level instead of at the free level. And these are all things that are going to be an important component of your governance in GCP as well. In Azure, you're also going to have Defender for Cloud, which is really important within Azure, and Purview is also extremely important, especially for SharePoint and things like that. And of course, there's Entra ID and other services that are really important in Azure too. In AWS, as we've already noted, Security Hub, Config, and then you have on top of that, you have Guard Duty, etc. There's a lot of different services that could be part of this. But for today, I just wanted to quickly go over the policy specifically and how that structure and functionality differs across these three CSPs. So in summary, even though no two CSPs will be identical, and what I mean by that is the services are not going to map one-to-one, the controls are likewise not going to map one-to-one. Nonetheless, the overall packaging or the collective services is still going to be similar between CSPs. And it's really important to map the controls that do exist in a given CSP to your standards first of all, and then across the other CSPs to see where you might have some gaps. First, you're going to want to establish your company's baseline standards before you ever evaluate those CSP controls, and that way you know what your goal is. Next, you're going to map each of those CSP's controls to those internal standards, and you're going to check for gaps there. Then you're going to compare across CSPs to highlight the differences, the nuances, and the potential gaps between what each CSP offers in terms of its controls. Then you're going to address those gaps strategically. In some cases, you can create a custom policy, right? In other cases, you can define an appropriate mitigation. And then finally, and this is an important point that many companies overlook, you are going to want to continuously monitor and update the mappings as both your company standards and the CSP offerings evolve. Thank you so much and have a fantastic day. Bye.